What happens when someone commissions me to plaster the side of his N-scale gondola with some hand-painted graffiti? Let's just say it's a lot of color, and that's coming up on JC's Riptrack. Hi there, my name is John, and welcome to JC's Riptrack. If this is your first time here and you're looking for advice and tips on how to transform your plastic models into something that looks like it belongs on the rails today, then click on subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime there's a new video. Before we get started, my question for those of you who have graffiti on your layout: how do you handle it? Do you use decal sheets? Do you do it freehand? Is it some sort of mix between the two? Let me know in the comment section below. If there is one feature in weathering that really seems to provoke the strongest reactions in model railroading, it is graffiti. It seems that everyone has an opinion on it. I know I do, although truthfully mine is a bit more nuanced. You've seen some of my own pieces that prominently figure graffiti largely because it is in the era that I model. It adds realism and is certainly prototypical. I appreciate graffiti as being an art form while at the same time also understanding it as being vandalism. In truth, it is all of those things, and whether you include it on your layout is really a matter of preference. As I mentioned in my original video about graffiti and patches, graffiti is nothing new. It has been around for thousands of years, right from the first cave drawings on forward. Hobos and rail workers used chalk to put codes and marks on rail cars long before the invention of the spray can. It means that you can have graffiti in any era, it's just the style and the form that changes. For our model trains, of course, having graffiti on your own layout is entirely your choice. It is your railroad after all. That being said, I received a commission from Austin to do something that I had never done before. A gondola where one side of it had been entirely covered by an enormous graffiti mural. He asked if I could replicate a prototype, so I promised him that I would give it my best shot. Looking at the prototype pictures, this kind of large work of graffiti is what is known among graffiti writers as a piece, short for masterpiece. This one is even large enough to be called a burner, which tends to be large, elaborate pieces done by a group of graffiti writers. Either way, it is different from a tag, which is nothing more than a small signature looking to the untrained eye as a small scribble in a single color. It is also different from what is called a throw-up, which still works like a signature, but is larger and easily sprayed onto a surface in one or two colors. There are other types of terminology, but at least for this video, the work that Austin asked me to do would be a piece or a burner that would take up the entire side of a newer CSX gondola. This one was so elaborate that it looked like either the writer took steps not to cover up the data information, or that someone in the company opted to leave the work there as the markings appear to be on top of the graffiti without any patches at all. And while we didn't have any pictures of the other side of the gondola, Austin and I agreed that it should be a complete contrast to the other side. In other words, it needed to be clean with not a single shred of graffiti anywhere on that side. Not only that, since the prototype gondola was fairly new, any sort of weathering would be minimal. The gondola that Austin sent me was an N-scale exact rail model lettered as being from the Louisville and Wadley Railroad. It was as close to the CSX gondola shape that we could find. He also sent me a set of microscale decals to apply to the model. In many respects, this wasn't just a weathering job. It was a repaint because I would be painting over all of the original markings and applying both graffiti and new decals to the model. I took the standard preparation steps with this model, although there were a couple of things that were a little bit different. The exact rail gondolas have body mount couplers. Now, that is actually less common on N-scale cars than HO scale, as many of these come with truck-mounted couplers, and it's often up to the owner to upgrade them to the body mount. I removed the trucks. I set the trucks and the wheel sets aside to be weathered later. As this gondola would receive a completely new set of decals, I decided that I would simply prime over the whole model rather than trying to strip it first. The original markings on this particular make are so thin that priming over them was more than adequate. I used Badger's Stynylrez Black Primer to coat the entire model, spraying thin coats until all of the markings were obscured. Now I should mention that all of the paint that I am using for the graffiti is acrylic. I'm using primarily Games Workshop paints, but some of the colors, especially the white and the black, are made by Privateer Press, which is another gaming paint line. These paints are ideal for this kind of colorful work. The next step involved creating the outlines for the big graffiti piece on the side. Using a mechanical pencil, I traced out the lines onto the model using a small steel ruler as needed. I used the ribs on the gondola as reference points, consulting with the prototype pictures as a guide. The main block letters of the graffiti piece are 5-letter phonetic spelling of highway. Everything else would be built around getting these block letters right. Once penciled in, I used a white gel pen to carefully trace over the graphite lines from the pencil. The white ink is difficult to apply, so the pencil is necessary to make sure that I get all of the lines right, and any sort of unevenness would be cleaned up in later steps. Most of the colors in this particular piece are lighter, almost pastel tones. This makes it necessary that the first color that I would use would be white to block in the shape of the letters. Because the car itself is entirely black, painting any of these lighter tones would simply get lost. In looking at the prototype photos, if you know what to look for, you can get an idea of how the writer went about their work. Since a lighter backdrop was needed for the pastel tones, I blocked in the letters in white. However, painting white over black, even a strongly pigmented one, requires always more than one coat. If it's too thick, the brush strokes become really obvious and the paint itself looks too thick and is out of scale. So instead, I started by painting an initial layer, keeping the paint at a good consistency, letting it dry, and then coming back with a second coat. The last step with the white was to do one last layer using Games Workshop's new contrast paint, specifically Apothecary White. I decided to use this because it is a unique paint that is like applying a paint and a wash at the same time. The main part of the letters would be white, while a light gray would collect in the recesses along the ribs of the gondola. Unfortunately, some of this footage was missed because of the filming error, but it gave me the look that I wanted. Next was to move on to the interior colors of the letters. Looking at the prototype photos, the writer used 4 different colors that were more pastel in tone. While I use the term pastel in this case, I don't mean pastel chalks or pan pastels, but rather pastel tone means a pale color that is achieved by adding a significant amount of white to it. So all 4 of the colors in addition to the white are pale blue, purple, orange, and yellow. And that would be the order that I would add them, moving from what are called cool colors to warm ones. I started using Lothern blue thinned with a bit of white. For this step, I had a picture of the prototype on my tablet immediately to my left, carefully trying to match it on the model. I was able to handle the purple using Dichala Lilac, and in the same way I filled in the block letters where there was purple in the prototype. Blocking in colors like this is helpful to start by drawing out the boundaries with a thin brush and then filling in the middle. After taking a short break, I moved on to the warm tones. Lugganath Orange was a near match for the pastel orange or peach color. This one was pretty dominant in the prototype, so it was important to get this one right. The palest of all the colors was yellow, which only had a real presence in the last 2 letters of the piece. This one was especially dependent upon a white base because it is both a pale and a thin paint. I used Dorn Yellow for this step, which matched the prototype nicely. Once the colors of the block letters were all done, it was time to move to the outside. To the left and right of the main letters of the graffiti piece were shapes that I'm loosely describing as green clouds. The end result has a lot of embellishments all over it, but before I get to those, I had to block in the colors. And this would take a bit more work than expected because matching the color would be more of a challenge, and I ended up doing this in a few stages. To paint a lighter color over black sometimes requires a bit of planning. I started by using a mix of Caliban green and Warpstone glow. Caliban green is a base color in the Games Workshop line, which means it covers quite well, whereas Warpstone is a layer which is thinner pigment-wise but also lighter and brighter. It works well for painting as it tends to blend well, and I used the two to paint the broad green cloud shapes, carefully following the prototype pictures. The next step was to use a much lighter green color called Gauss Blaster Green. Instead of doing one thick coat, I kept it thin and applied a second coat of the same color after the first one had dried. Now, mixed in with the base green, there was also a highlight green that also stood out, and using a very fine brush, I used a yellowish green color called Skarsnik green to paint outlines around the clouds, as well as to fill in various holes in and around and under the main letters of the graffiti piece. At this point, I was now done the block colors, or at least so I thought. I used a black micron pen to sharpen up the lines around the edges of the letters, making sure that any sort of soft or ragged edges were covered up. This also reinforced the shadow shape outline that I would fill in what I thought would be the next step, but I would have to fix something else first. Now here's a little fun fact. The human eye can see more shades of green than any other color. Sometimes that is great, but sometimes it can work against what you're trying to do. After having painted the previous color step, I was not happy with it. To match the prototype, I had to move to a bluer green than what was on the model. It meant going back over what I had already done for the block colors on the green clouds. Taking a closer look at the color that I had versus the picture, and in consulting with Austin, I created a color mix using Isotek green, Morrow white, Gauss Blaster green, and that felt to be a closer match to the prototype picture. Once I did that, I could then do what I had planned to do after the micron pen by filling in the outlines using Thamar black. By filling in the shadows on the graffiti block letters, it helped create a 3D effect and made the letters really stand out. And once both Austin and I were happy with the color of the clouds, I then used a thin 00 brush, painting the trim around the embellishment on the cloud with Moot green. The last stage of this graffiti piece would be to create a complex array of embellishments across all of the colors on the model. And while they were all white paint, I ended up using a few approaches to this process. I started with a brush tip Faber-Castel paint pen that did the work well for some of it, but needed a thinner tip for some of the final work. And after working with the pen for a little bit, I then switched off to 00 brush and Morrow white for the final embellishment details and including some writing. With most of the work being done, I carefully looked over everything, touching things up with the black micron pen and some bits and pieces of green until I was happy with it. And while this was the central defining feature of the car, it still needed some work in a few places before I could return it to Austin. The next major step was to apply the decals, and it was a fairly straightforward process, but as you will see, there were some challenges to it. Now, my decal application method always starts with a gloss clear coat. It protects all of the work that I've already done and prepares a smooth surface for applying the decals. This reduces the chances of silvering that can sometimes happen when applying decals to models. I started applying the road name and number to the graffiti side to match the prototype, but I quickly realized that the yellow lettering would be nearly invisible. And while the video shows me applying the decals and where they are supposed to go, you can't see them in the video. I would have to do something about this a little bit later, and I'll be getting to that. After letting the road numbers dry, it was then time to apply the data marking decals, and I tried to pick ones that would be more easily seen on top of the graffiti. The load capacity decals, I decided to use black lettering to stand out against the white and light blue where it was applied, and that seems to be true with the prototype as well. And the consolidated stencil is easily visible on the right side of the car. I let the decals dry, applying microsol to make sure that the film would dissolve and make sure the decals were lying as flat as possible to the model. Oddly enough, the decals on the non-graffiti side were important to get right because they represented a largely untouched factory paint and would be a huge contrast to the graffiti-covered side. Unlike the graffiti side, I also made sure to use the larger CSX decals that are common on gondolas like this. I checked several reference pictures to get this as close to the general prototype as I could. The last of the decals would be the safety stripes on both sides. I happened to have a small sheet of them from Highball Graphics. These were straightforward to apply, and I just made sure to match the prototype. Before moving on to the flat coat off camera, I brushed on some gloss varnish over all of the decals to protect them and to seal them into place. Despite having an extensive graffiti piece on one side of this car, this would be only lightly weathered. Even newer gondolas, though, have interiors that quickly show dirt, wear, and rust, and the outside might just have a light bit of dust, particularly on the underside. For the gondola's interior, I used rust-colored shavings that I had made when experimenting with the weathering pencils in my review videos. I saved these and found a good place to use them. I had set up a small cup of water, added some golden acrylics wetting agent to prevent the water from beating up. I then poured the shavings into the gondola's tub, and then used a brush that I use for acrylic paints. I wet it in the cup and proceeded to work the shavings into the surface of the interior. This worked quite well, creating the illusion of a lightly worn interior to the gondola. As I mentioned earlier, the road numbers on the graffiti side of the gondola were virtually invisible. Looking at the prototype, someone had added some black accent lines to make them stand out, while keeping the majority of this graffiti piece. And I was able to simulate this using a black micron pen to carefully draw a shadow edge along the right side of each letter and number. Did you know that not all graffiti is applied by vandals? When doing the research on these gondolas, I found several example pictures where the road name of the number of the car had been spray painted on the interior end of the car. This appears to be so that they are easily visible to crews who are standing on a locomotive or at the end of a row of cars. After checking with Austin, we decided to add this to one end of the interior of the car. The real trick to doing something like this is not to simply write the number from left to right. There's always a risk of running out of space. Instead, start with the first and last letters or numbers at either end of what you're working on. Then move to the middle, and then work back and forth until everything is done. This helps with spacing and lowers the risk of messing something up. I painted both the trucks and the wheel sets using Badger's Stynylrez red-brown primer using a brush rather than an airbrush. Once this had dried, I applied an acrylic wash called Agrax Earthshade to the truck frames to bring out all the details. The last steps were to give the car a flat coat with Tamiya Flat Clear, and I let it dry and then reassembled the trucks and secured them to the model, making sure that the screw holding the trucks in place was not too tight. After giving the wheels a quick test, this gondola was all done, ready for both pictures and a trip back to Austin's care. So I hope you found this as a helpful guide for your own projects. I know that graffiti isn't everyone's thing, but the process of painting something like this can work as a guide for something similar. Plus, there's an example of employee applied graffiti as part of it. So if you want more tips on how to get the most out of your painting and weathering projects, don't forget to hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Also, if you haven't already, check out the other videos on this channel as well as some of the social media links down below. I've also included a link to my brand new Amazon page that includes a number of the weathering products that I've used in this video. And if you like seeing how Austin's commission went and you'd like to see how one of your own might look, go check out my Patreon page and you can get involved in the creative process for this channel. So thanks so much for watching, good luck, and may you keep on track.